Okay, so we're gonna get started here. We may actually, believe it or not, get out early today, but I have some material that I'd like to convey, which should result in a process for your projects that can be reflected in some of your upcoming deliverables. And that has to do with defect estimation. When we're dealing with a software project, there's often a lot of uncertainty about several factors. How long things will take to develop. We're going to be talking about that in the next few lectures with software estimation. But another big one is that has a big bearing on how long this project's going to take to finish, concerns this issue of how many defects are there out there. Okay, and I hoped I had a slide right here that would actually show that I could actually show a key point here. But you may remember from a past lecture that I had at one point presented a sort of diagram showing the life of a bug's life, right? Where we have defects, we have system trouble incidents that come in and they get sanitized. Sanitization removes duplicates, outdated ones, things that are problematic, things that are problematic in the sense that they might not describe an actual bug, maybe based on some misunderstanding or what have you, an outdated spec. Some are triage, these are important ones. There's a directed triage process that determines which of them are actually going to get fixed. And then there are assigned to developers, and developers having perceived that they fixed them might report them, and then there's some confirmation before the defect report can actually be fully resolved and closed. But a very important uncertainty here, a big glaring area of unsettling uncertainty and risk has to do with this stock of undiagnosed bugs. How many bugs are out there that we don't know about yet? How many defects are there in the system which we just haven't discovered yet? A low count in the number of bug reports in any of these stages here could be a good sign or it could be a bad sign. Give me a reason that a low number could be a good sign.
There might not be that many bugs.
Yeah, there are not many bugs. You're converging, the project's coming together, and you're going to be, you're going to be quickly able to finish the project. Give me another reason why a low number here might be a bad sign. Yeah, you're not finding the necessary bugs. You haven't done the hard work needed to really allow you to identify those problems that are out there, those latent problems, these undiagnosed bugs. So the size of this stock, the size of this group, the number of undiagnosed bugs is really important. It's really a first order issue in terms of how quickly the project's going to complete. Not least because, as some of you folks may be learning, if you find a defect, if there's a system trouble incident, and that's located, it takes a while before it can get to the point where it's actually being assigned to somebody, getting fixed, and then that's being checked. And each iteration here, believe fixed back to, discovered to be unfixed. In some cases it can come back even here to undiagnosed bugs. Each of those rounds could take, a week, 2, 3. And if you're dealing with a situation where you need to ship, you need to provide this system to clients, you may not have the luxury of iterating on this thing very quickly. And so, if you've got a lot of undiagnosed defects yet, that's telling you, we've got a way to go. There's a long lead time before we might be able to fix everything. So estimating the size of this pool of undiagnosed defects, undiagnosed bugs is really important. But by definition, it's almost difficult to directly estimate it, right? They're undiagnosed. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they are. We don't know how many of them there are. Almost by definition, it's an area of ignorance, of some ignorance. But it turns out that there are ways of trying to estimate the number of defects out there that we don't know about. And there's three basic methods that we're going to be discussing today, very briefly. One of them, the one that I think of as kind of least broadly suitable, but for large organizations, for a place like Vendasta, it's probably big enough. Certainly a place like IBM or Hewlett-Packard or Microsoft or Google. There may be enough historic data. You have some basis for getting some estimate about how many defects are out there. But this is, as they say, it's difficult to forecast. Forecasting is difficult, especially about the future. That's a joke. But there's some truth to it. The point is, it's hard to anticipate what's coming based on our past. It's a little bit like trying to drive forward looking out the back window of your car. If you're in a situation where you're on a big circular track, you might do an okay job because it's bending around going forward in a way similar to the past. But historic data is not always a good indication of where you're at going forward. Past results or past earnings are not necessarily indicative of future results. So historic data has some challenges, as we'll see. It also requires that data be available. We're going to be talking about defect seeding and defect pooling. Both of these, by contrast, are approaches your teams can use. And they're, in fact, an approach that I'd like to see your team use in coming weeks here. Okay? And each of these approaches has some significant shortcomings, okay? There's limited accuracy, complications for schedule, there's assumptions, and there's some duplication of effort. But in the end, it's going to allow us to get some understanding of just how big this group of undiagnosed bugs is. Get some understanding of that, okay? So the idea of historic data is pretty straightforward. You have this organization that's been doing development for a while with similar technologies, mind my words there, and you basically use this historic data to estimate the total defect count to be expected. So the idea is, look, within our organization, we found that we typically have a certain number of lines of defects per line of code, and so normally we have 5 defects per 1,000 lines of code. Right now we've only found 2 defects, or say 2.5 defects per lines of code, and that's given us 200 defects. And the idea here is, well, if our norm is kind of 5 defects per 1,000 lines of code, we've only found half of that in terms of density of defects, and we found 200 bugs so far. We're probably dealing with something around 400 bugs. The idea is, look, that's kind of our historic rate. The primary problem is indeed past results are not necessarily indicative of future performance. What can change between historic data and now? Why is this problematic to apply?
Your process should change.
Your process should change, yeah. So hopefully you learn something from past projects, right? So you do better. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, one of the biggest points that you should come away with from this class is, when you find a defect, you don't just fix the defect in your code base. maybe sometimes you don't, because the risk is too great for the stakeholders. But what you can do is fix a defect in your process that allowed that to come about in the first place, or allowed it to go undetected for so long. You fix a process defect. So hopefully you're learning. And so maybe traditionally there've been 5 defects per 1,000 lines of code, but maybe you're upping your game and there's only these days 3, and so you're actually doing a lot better. Other things change too. What else changes?
Team members.
Team members. So maybe now you have more new members who are newer to the code base, less familiar with the technologies, and maybe they're more likely to make mistakes. Or maybe it's the same people, but they've been there for longer and they have a much better understanding of the code base and of the technologies, and so they're less likely to make mistakes. So it could be different individuals, or it could be the same individuals with more experience. It could be something else that changes. Technology changes quickly. So we have, we use Slack now. We didn't used to use Slack. Now we have better coverage testing procedure. Our build machinery has changed. Our technology for doing stress testing has changed. I mean, there can be significant changes in technology that bear on the software development tools that can prevent defects. Okay, so historic data, even if you have the luxury of maintaining it, typically things move fast enough that it loses a lot of its value, and there's enough change that it's hard to know with confidence how things are likely to play out. So the next 2 approaches are going to be motivated by the following analogy. Okay? Suppose you want to estimate the number of fish in a lake. So there's a lake out there. Lake Defect, right? Lake Defect. Suppose you want to estimate how many fish are in there. And suppose you have 100 fish tags. These are things you can use to tag a fish to indicate, if you were to see it, that, oh, that's a fish I've caught before, or what have you. How would you proceed? Yeah.
You could go one day and tag 100 fish,
Yeah.
and then next day come back and try to catch them and count the number of tagged fish you
Exactly.
found.
Now, okay, so that's exactly right. And under what situation, what type of result, qualitatively speaking, would lead you to think there's a ton of fish in the lake?
It depends on the ratio of tagged
Yeah.
fish you found.
Okay. So if on that second day, that later day, what would be indicative of there being more fish in the lake? If there were lots of fish you caught that second day, which had your tags, or few? Few, okay. So suppose that second day you only caught 1 fish out of the 100 you catch that second day that have your tag, has your tag on it. You think there's more fish or fewer fish in the lake than if you found 50 of them had it? Yeah, a lot more, right? If what you're catching is about 1% of the fish constitute these 100 fish you caught earlier, then there might be 100 times 100 or 10,000 fish in that lake. Okay, so good. So here we can estimate using these proportions. Now there's a bunch of assumptions here, right? So if you caught, tagged, and released 50 fish, for example, you found 100 more fish, you found 5 of those are found to be tagged. You figure, okay, probably those 50 are 1/20th of all the fish in the lake. Here you've caught, because only 1/20th of these fish you ended up catching later, are found to be tagged, right? So if these 50 are 1/20th of the total, again, the 20 comes from 100 divided by 5. Only 1 out of 20 of the fish that we caught the next day were actually tagged. So we're figuring these 50 that we caught and tagged are about 1/20th of the whole lake. A decent first ballpark guess would be 1,000. You have 1,000 fish. No, in the whole lake. Why is this? So what assumptions does this rest on? It's not without its assumptions.
The fish are all evenly dispersed across the lake?
Fish are evenly dispersed. You're equally likely to catch one fish as another. Right? Other things? Well, yeah, catches of fish are independent, right? You're not just catching the same fish. Okay, suppose that second day you catch those 100 and 50 of them are fish that you've caught before. You know, all 50 of them are fish you've caught before. Maybe it's just because you're trawling in the same area of the lake or something. You're not going to a larger area. Maybe you're catching less elusive fish. And indeed, there's a real phenomena with defects having to do with finding the same. Remember, you may remember from a previous lecture, and it may actually be this one here, where I was talking about changes in the number of defects found over time. It looks like it's not, the slide is not in there. But turns out that we tend to find easy defects first. Why is that? Why do we find easy defects first? Anyone?
Because they're easy to find.
They're easy to find. It's much like this with oil and gas industry for many years. The oil reservoirs that they found were the big ones. Those are the ones you find if you put down a well. You're more likely to strike a big one than a small one. It's because they're big, right? If you go and you sample the riders on Saskatoon Transit, you ask how many times a week do you use Saskatoon Transit, you get back skewed results. Results that are skewed towards people who ride it a lot, because you sample the ones who are on there a lot. If you were to actually somehow magically keep track, it's not magic, if you were to keep track using smartphones or what have you, people who actually ride that transit, each individual you ask how many times they run, you'd get a much probably lower distribution than if you were to ask people on the bus, because the people you get on the bus are the people who are on the bus a lot. And so it is with these sorts of defects. You know, we find things that are obvious, right? And once we've eliminated them, we go down to somewhat less obvious things. But we find things that are easier to find, and then we tend to find things that are like them because we try similar things that gives us ideas. So these are part of the challenges of dealing with trying to guess how soon, you know, we will get closure on our testing and on our quality assurance processes. So there's two basic approaches that build on this analogy of the fish to kind of be able to estimate defects. One of them you may be shocked by, and it's called defect seeding. There's different terms by which you'll hear it. Another one I think is fault injection. The idea here is you actually inject faults into your program. In a controlled way, of course. You actually deliberately insert defects. And then you see how many of them turn up in your regression test suite, for example. In your whole set of test suites to find out how many of them would be found, right? So here you seed a number of defects, and the goal is to do it in a way that's fairly broad. You introduce these mistakes, and you see basically how many of them get found in the testing that goes on. And you say, okay, well, you know, if we seeded 100 defects and only 50 of them were found, the ones we found are probably about half the total And if we found a total number of defects, 300 defects, probably the total number of defects, judging by what fraction of our seeded defects we're finding, those are kind of the tracers. If we have a total of 300 defects that we found in the entire program thus far, maybe we have 600 total. We're finding about half, right? Finding about half. You kind of use the seeded ones to give you the sense of proportion. Are we finding half of those out there? Are we finding a quarter or a tenth? And that's a function of your test suite and your inspections, etc. Now, as you can imagine, this is a little bit tricky, right? These seeded defects should cover broad areas of functionality. This should be kind of representative of defects out there, many different levels of severity. And clearly you want to seed prior to the beginning of tests. And for automated tests, you could seed at any point during it. But what's very important is you want to remove them, right? You need to clear them out when you're done. And so, and moreover, during your testing process, you want to intercept them. Why do you want to intercept them? Why do you want to stop them at time of sanitization? Well, basically, you don't want someone to go fix them, debug them, and try to figure out. There's no point in that. They're artificially induced defects, and so you end up catching them and basically remove them at that point. You don't have actually try to fix them and debug them. Now there are problems here. You may forget, you mess up when trying to fix them. Someone tries to fix them. Attempted fixes can introduce other problems, and can cause resentment in the sense that you're having people's code break when there's no problem with the code themselves. There's some challenges here. You want to keep defects simple, but at the same time try to have them be kind of representative, and you want to eliminate them carefully before you ship the code. You want to make sure they're not in there. And as you might not be surprised to hear, there's people who research automatic ways of doing this. So they inject automatically, they run a whole suite of tests, and then they remove them. And it's all done automatically, and you get a sense of, okay, what proportion of these things are found, and it gives you a sense of what proportion of all defects out there in the code base are found. Not many smaller firms do this. There are some large ones that do. There's a number of larger firms, IBM and HP among them, that have done quite some work on defect seeding. There's a literature on it. IBM has demonstrated it's actually a quite effective process for identifying gaps or problems in the testing process. So this can help you figure out what types of things are not being caught, what types of things are slipping through, etc. Okay. Defect seeding. You could try some defect seeding for your projects. You have to do so with delicacy. And you're going to want to be quite careful to remove these things. Defect pooling is, however, the main approach that I recommend. Simple, actionable, fun, insightful. So the idea here is, again, one that draws on this notion from the fish tagging analogy we gave. In the fish tagging, we caught a bunch of fish, tagged them, released them, and caught them later. And that went on sequentially, so one day, the next day. But we could generalize that and just say, okay, there's two pools of caught things. So pool A is maybe one subset of your group. Half the members of your group go and they have a bug party on one side of space. Another half of your group go that same evening without talking without communicating via Slack or what have you, with no emails back and forth, and they have a bug party too, and they try to find a bunch of bugs, bunch of defects. Work for 2 hours, 3 hours finding defects, both sides. And then you look at what? What's the whole point of this? Okay, so both groups go off and do it, and they find some defects, but what are you interested in here? What's a key thing that will give you insight to how many bugs are there out there that they haven't found? You're looking at what?
Intersection.
The intersection between the two compared to the size of all that they found. So suppose you had two teams, right? Highly productive teams. One team found 50, suppose both teams found 50. 50, right? 50 defects each. Great evening, 50 defects each. So a total of 100 have been found, but only 5 of them had overlap. There are only 5 common ones found. How many defects would you think are out there? Sorry?
A lot.
A lot. Indeed. Can we get a little bit stronger estimate than that?
Definitely greater than 95.
Sorry?
Definitely greater than 95.
Greater than 95, sure. So, again, one group found 50, the other group found 50. There's an overlap of 5. How many do you think might be out there? Well, consider one group, right? Group A. They found 50. There's an overlap of 5. About 1/10 of theirs had overlap with this other group, right? Only about 1/10 of those were found by the other group as well. And therefore, we'd estimate the total number of defects likely to be out there is given by this formula. The defects in pool A, so that's 50, times the defects in pool B, 50, divided by both. So you could think of it as kind of A times defects in B divided by the overlap. So here would be 50 times 50 divided by 5, right? So 50 times 50 over 5, or 10. So it's 500 total defects, okay? So here you're operating 2 independent pools. You could think of it as very similar to pool A, you know, is a group that you found and tagged. Pool B is the group you found the next day of fish. But here you're operating independent. You want to be sure you're operating independently. So you could have 2 bug parties going on at the same time, a couple hours, no coordination. You're testing the full scope of the software, and you have, you know, different sets of staff at each one, right? So here, the defects are being found not sequentially by the same group over time in a tagged way, but rather 2 groups operating sequentially. But the same basic idea. Before, pool A was the group we found on the first day, tagged. Pool B was the group of fish we found on the second day, and then we looked for the overlap, and we applied the same formula. Just here we're applying it to 2 simultaneous ones, right? Okay, so defect pooling is a very good practice. It's also one that is it's straightforward, and it's actionable now. It's insightful. You can get a sense of how many are out there. If those 2 groups of 50 are jointly only finding 5, you've got a lot out there. You've got a lot of work cut out for you. if 45 of them, or 40 of them, are ones that have been found by the other, then you're dealing with a much less overwhelming situation. So the analogy here is completely analogous to the fish case, recognizing that pool A is to be thought of as the first day and pool B for the second day. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is, beyond the thing about running a bug party for your team in general, is set up 2 different teams, preferably at the same time. You don't want them to share knowledge. What's the problem if they're sharing knowledge?
You're skewing the data.
You're really skewing the data, and you're skewing it in a way where basically you're going to lead to a lot of discovery of similar defects potentially, and as a result, you're going to be underestimating the number of defects that are out there that are not yet discovered. After all, if they did 50-50 and all but a few had already been found, you'd think there are a few defects out there you haven't already discovered. There's a high common overlap. You want the teams to be working creatively and independently. And you probably want some of your testers in both teams. You want to identify and list these defects. After all, they're useful for reporting, right? In your defect tracking or issue tracking system of choice. And you're going to obviously need to meet together to identify which are basically the same bugs. And you're going to estimate then the total count, the known defects, plus these ones which have been estimated through this procedure. And plus these latent ones, these ones that aren't yet found. So you want to estimate that total size that are likely to be out there. And again, I give the formula here. I would expect you to know this formula and to be comfortable with it. It's the basic formula we use for the fish. The idea is, okay, you tag them, and you look what fraction, when you're fishing the next day, what fraction of those that you're catching now were ones you caught before, and you use that to estimate the total, how the total collection relate to the number you've caught now. Is this fairly straightforward to people? Feeling comfortable with it? Okay, so I want you to actually undertake this and give me an estimate of the number of defects out there. You're not going to be penalized if you estimate there's a large number of defects. I'd much rather you sort of put that forward and show that you've done due diligence and you've actually found this. I'll take it as a sign of creativity in a way. If the 2 teams are working, they're not finding many defects in common. Now, if you're dealing with very small numbers, if you go for 3 hours and each team is only finding, 5, 4, 2 number of defects, you're going to get a pretty coarse estimate. So you really want to apply yourselves and try to find these things. I don't think in your projects you're going to have trouble finding some defects. And only keep a straight face for long. Okay. So running bug parties. Okay. I'd like you to be sure to do this and be sure to see if we can use it to estimate the number of defects. Okay. Now for something totally different. So defect estimation. And again, the goal. Let's try to estimate the total number of defects out there, not just the ones we know about now, not just these ones down here, but undiagnosed bugs. Okay? Any questions on that before I go on to something very different? Very different. Okay? No questions? Okay. So I will expect you to undertake this. Let us now stop the recording.